Very excited to be here, folks. As Anthony mentioned, like one of my biggest passions in the job search process might sound bizarre for individuals, but is how do we nail the interview process? Just as a quick background on myself, I'm currently a career coach. I help folks, particularly in the tech startup ecosystem, navigate the job search end to end. Prior to that, I've been in a variety of different commercial leadership roles at a total of 4 different startups, including the likes of Whoop and Superhuman. So I've seen hiring from the company side. I've been through the recruiting process on the job seeker side as well. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is figuring out how do we help position each of your incredible profiles as effectively as possible through the process. So the focus of the session today is very much going to be on how do we have more of an intentional approach to our interviewing to really help yourselves stand out and get hired. Just quick check that everyone can see the screen. Awesome. Before we get into the tactics, one call out I do want to make is that I think we actually undervalue interviewing today. It's no secret that interviewing is a key part of the process in landing an offer. But I think one of the biggest reasons we undervalue it is that that first step of the job search process feels the most challenging and time consuming for us. And it ends up being where we spend the majority of our time, right? I'm sure that many of you on the call who spend a ton of time figuring out what type of role to apply to, finding those roles, customizing your resume, applying, doing all the great sort of personalized outreach that is necessary to get your foot in the door to land an interview. All of that work is really important. It's also very time consuming, and we end up spending about 80% of our energy and time on that step. And what it ends up meaning is we take quite a reactive approach to interviews. The second thing to call out is that interviewing, as much as we wish it were an evaluation of finding the best fit for a role, in many ways, it's actually an opportunity to sell yourself strategically. And it's not just about showcasing that you have the exact skills to get hired. So I think many folks go into the interview process assuming if I have the skills, they will see that through the process and I will get an offer. Unfortunately, that's not the case. You do need to be quite mindful about how you actually position your profile. And I've seen many scenarios where folks who maybe have not quite as much relevant experience as another applicant have been more successful through the process just by being really intentional and strategic in the process. The other thing to call out, it's a tough market right now. There are a lot of companies that are hiring, but there are also a lot of companies that can afford to be quite picky through their interview process. So one trend I've noticed is there are companies that will often actually go through a whole interview process and decide not to hire anyone that they interview through that process and start the process again. While that's unfortunate, the takeaway from that is really that companies are looking for those strong yes candidates when they're grading folks from 1 to 4. So you're really not just trying to distinguish yourself from some other applicants, but the overall bar for actually hitting on an interview is a lot higher than it used to be. So none of that is designed to scare everyone on this call. The good news is that there are tactics you can use to really position yourself well that we'll talk about today. But I did want to call out that interviewing is about really being proactive and preempting and preparing. You don't just want to wait until you land an interview and then start preparing for it. There is a lot to do before those steps, and we'll talk about some of those things in the session today. Just to give a little bit of a structure, I'll walk through a few tactics. We'll then have a little bit of a chance to self-reflect, do some breakouts where we'll actually do some interview practice one-to-one in some breakout rooms, and then we'll finish with some Q&A as well. So 4 key strategies that I want to focus on today. The first is going to be delivery style. So not just what you say, but how you actually deliver that is really, really important. We're going to talk about how you cater your answers to your audience. So you want to tweak your interview approach ultimately depending on who is interviewing you. We're going to talk about how you reverse engineer messages. Everyone on this call has certain spikes and superpowers. The goal in your interview is to make sure you leave those interviews with your interviewer knowing exactly what those are. How do we bring those up in natural, authentic ways through the conversation? And then I'll share just a couple of examples of ways that you can go above and beyond in the interview process. There are some things that you can do even between interviews that can really help you stand out. So I'll share a few of those ideas as well. So on delivery style, let's start. My view is early in the interview, the style of what you're saying matters more than the substance. The biggest way I've seen folks make a negative impression in an interview is you get asked the classic "tell me about yourself" question, and you go on a 5, 6 minute random walk on all your experiences. The interviewer disengages, and you've lost them for the rest of the conversation. And I think one way to think about this is actually to flip the view and focus on what is the experience from the interviewer's shoes perspective. That person, although this is probably the highest stakes 30 minutes of your day, it's probably not going to be the exact same case for the interviewer, right? They are jumping between meetings. They're likely tired. Their brain might be scrambled, moving from one context to the next. They're probably meeting a few different folks for the role. So you really want to find a way to be memorable quickly. And ultimately, people remember feelings more than words. One of my favorite studies out of UCLA actually shows that when your nonverbal cues differ from the words you're using, actually the majority of the interpretation of your skill set is dependent on your body language and tone. Nearly 95% of how someone will evaluate your competency is going to be on non-verbal cues. So that's obviously going to be a little bit different over a Zoom call, but the general philosophy still applies and is really important to remember. So your delivery becomes the most important component in those first few minutes of an interview. And with that in mind, I think there are like three things that matter most on delivery. The first is clarity. Can you structure a response really clearly? Do you minimize your ums and hesitations? And ultimately, can you deliver a really clear answer? Concision. I think there are many folks on this call that are likely targeting mid to senior level roles, especially for those roles. Concision is really critical because it's viewed as a proxy for executive presence. Can you convey information clearly and succinctly? And then the last is engagement. This one's a little bit more nebulous, but ultimately you have to ask yourself, am I engaging my interviewer? The two ways I see this done most effectively are one, the confidence of the content that you're delivering, and then the passion or excitement with which you speak about the company or the role. That really comes out in your interview answers. So that style is going to be the first really critical component of setting the right tone early in the interview. The next piece is catering to your audience. So interviewing is not one size fits all. It really is a game, and there are different players within the game. So the three main stakeholders are the recruiter, the hiring manager, and then what we'll call, for the purposes of this discussion, the interview panel, which will be some cross-functional stakeholders, maybe an additional leader. For the recruiter, they have been tasked by the hiring manager to evaluate against a strict criteria. So they will not be a domain expert, and their goal is really listing out for keywords. It's almost like the next level of evaluation on your resume. So you need to make sure that you're already signposting your answers with keywords very clearly for this one to resonate. What's great about the recruiter conversation is that they're also in many ways your secret weapon. So they will give you as much information as you will be able to give in the conversation as well. And they'll often reveal really critical elements of the role requirements that will help you in later stages. So with the recruiter, you have two goals in mind. The first is, how can I tick the boxes that they have to move to the hiring manager interview? How do I make sure I'm signposting those answers really clearly so that makes it easy for them to know that I have the necessary skills and experience? But then they will also shift the conversation and give you the opportunity to ask questions. You really want to not just use those as filler questions, but understand truly what is most important to the hiring manager for this role. And the goal of that is setting yourself up for success in the next round. When you meet that hiring manager, how can I go into that conversation with as much information as possible about what really, really matters to be successful in this role, what the hiring manager's style is, all those nuances and details that will allow me to prepare well for that conversation. Then you go into the hiring manager round. This is likely the most important stakeholder. They're the decision maker for bringing someone into the role. And ultimately, they're evaluating whether you can come in and take the reins in this particular functional area or scope that you're applying for. Every hiring manager is different, but generally speaking, some of the traits I've seen are hiring managers will often want someone who's been there, done that to some extent. They want to de-risk their hire. They want someone that's easy to work with. They're envisioning that this person's going to report to them. How am I going to get along with this person? Are they going to be easy for me to manage? Do they maybe cover up a blind spot that I might have as a hiring manager? And do I generally feel like there's an alignment in values or personality style? And some of that will come from your ability to mirror their own style. So a lot of that is personal to the hiring manager. As I said, it's difficult to figure all of that out live on a call when you're also trying to remember all the examples that you want to present in an interview. So the more you can front load that preparation, the better. Few areas where I would recommend folks focus going into that conversation. The first is obviously the recruiter conversation, pulling out as much insight as you can there. The second is the job description itself. You can have two almost identical job descriptions, but the way that the bullets have been written, there's a lot of nuance in those bullets that you can parse out to really understand what the priority of the role might be. Look at the order of the bullets. Typically, the first few are most important. Look at how they actually word certain requirements. Are they nice to haves? Are they really aggressive in their language that might showcase that this is going to be a deal breaker for them that you want to make sure you come in with a really strong example for? So the job description is going to give you a ton of information. And then some hiring managers are also more public in their profile. So look at their LinkedIn, see if they have posted anything recently, have reposted anything, comment on company posts. That will give you both a sense on what's top of mind for the company and its priorities, but also for this hiring manager, what's their style. And then my favorite, if you get lucky, you can find articles that the hiring manager has written and or podcasts that they've been on, especially hiring managers that will be on commercial sided roles. So roles in strategy, sales, operations, CS. It's becoming more common for some of those individuals to make podcast appearances. There's a ton of information you can gather from those conversations. You can obviously see over 70, 80-minute conversation. How do they interact with the interviewer? What are the areas that they focus on? Typically, they're going into those conversations trying to sell their own company or their vision in some way. So you can really start to understand what's important to them. And then the last stakeholder group is going to be your panel. So typically, this is a cross-functional group of colleagues that you'll be working with. Each panelist is tasked with focusing on a couple of areas to assess. And the key in my mind here is, again, figuring out what are the focus areas for those panelists that they're assessing and being prepared with great examples for that. So sometimes the recruiter is going to preempt that for you, fortunately, and tell you which panelist is focused on what. If they're not, there are certain assumptions that you can make, or at least best guesses you can go to. Let's say, for example, you're applying for a product marketing role, and one of the panelists is in customer success or sales. You can likely assume they're going to be testing your ability to work with cross-functional partners. So you want to make sure those examples are really well fleshed out. If you're speaking to a panelist that's on the people team, or maybe a panelist that's even one level above your hiring manager in more of a leadership role, that can likely signal that conversation will be more of a culture fit conversation, a general company and competency conversation. And then often those panelists will also include one person on that team. So, in this product marketing example, if you had another panelist that was on the marketing team, maybe on the digital marketing team, it's likely that individual is going to be assessing you for functional expertise. So the goal in these conversations is, rather than trying to excel across all facets, you really want to make sure you're honing your answers and examples to what is likely the focus area for that panelist, because they're going into the round table with the hiring manager afterwards, and the hiring manager's lens with that panelist is, how do we feel like Saif is from a culture fit perspective? How do we feel like Saif is in terms of his ability to dive in and jump into product marketing projects for us? So you don't want to try and boil the ocean in terms of your focus area there. So the biggest advice I have for folks on catering is, try and put yourself in the company's shoes, in the audience's shoes. Make it about them, not about you, in the answers that you deliver. The next really important component is reverse engineering messages. So typically we will approach interviews quite reactively. We get a question, we answer it, 30 minutes will fly by. We'll reflect after the interview and feel maybe a little bit frustrated that we didn't put our best foot forward or didn't have a chance to showcase X great project that I worked on. Now, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to do that, but often that happens because we didn't go into the interview with enough intentionality. So piece of advice I give job seekers is try to think of one or two key takeaways based on the job description and what you know about what the interviewer and hiring manager value that you want to deliver during that interview. Let's say, for example, you know that people leadership is an important aspect of the role that you're recruiting for. And during the recruiter screen, you could tell that the recruiter was a little bit iffy on your prior leadership experience and whether you have sufficient experience to manage a team of this size. That can become one of your key message points that you want to deliver during the hiring manager interview. So you think of a strong example, and then the goal is, can I deliver that example organically? The key is organically in the flow of an interview. And really the way to do that is try not to have too many key messages. Your brain's going to be scattered and you're trying to fit round pegs in square holes, and it's going to come across very disjointed. But if you have one or two, try to find those opportunities to bring those up. I typically have 3 levels of kind of best to worst. So the best way to bring it up is if they ask you about it directly. It's the most natural, obviously. You can just answer the question directly. If they don't ask you directly, let's say about your people leadership experience, you can sometimes naturally weave it into a more open-ended question. So say they ask, what are you most excited about in this role, or why are you interested in company X? That answer can be taken in so many different directions, but that could be your opportunity to strategically focus on the team building component of the role if you know that that's one of your key messages you want to deliver. And then your last resort is to incorporate the message into a question at the end of the interview. So again, let's use the product marketing role as an example and saying one of my key messages is building a team. I could frame a question around having built and led a product marketing team in my prior role. I'm really excited that this role has a heavy emphasis on team building as well. I would love to hear what's most important to you in building a strong team culture at Company X. So that way you plant the seed of your people leadership experience while still segueing into a really powerful question that can give you some interesting insights about the company as well. The fourth tactic that I want to just quickly talk on before we move into breakout is how do you actually separate yourself throughout the process? So between interviews, what I've typically seen good candidates do is send thank you notes to each interviewer. That's great. I think it does a nice job of ticking the boxes of showing that you're interested in the role, shows appreciation to each of the folks on the panel. Doesn't really distinguish you from the rest of the crowd, though. What I've seen the best candidates do is find a way to organically start doing the role. And typically this will come after the hiring manager interview. You will, at that point, know whether the role is really exciting for you, whether you feel like it could be a good fit. Maybe if that conversation went well, you'll also know what's most important to the hiring manager for this role and priorities for the team. So what you can do at this stage is pick one priority area that the company's working on and craft a very short memo outlining how you would tackle that priority area. The goal of this memo is threefold. One, you want to actually deliver value to the hiring manager so they receive that and think, wow, this is useful for us. That will also show them versus tell them how you work. And it signals your ownership and commitment to the role because it's a very low percentage of folks that will actually take the time to do that. And psychologically, the hiring manager will also start to see you in that role. One example I will share with the group from actually a recent client of mine who did this. He was applying for a sales engineering role at a B2B SaaS company. The company had recently been approached by the US government for a pilot opportunity. This had come up in his hiring manager conversation, and the hiring manager had mentioned that we're not exactly sure whether to pursue the government space because there's a lot of compliance requirements around FedRAMP that we haven't done before. This client had actually looked into FedRAMP in a prior role. So he put together a pretty simple memo that was just the 3 different levels of FedRAMP compliance that you could get as a company, along with the pros and cons and anticipated timelines and requirements to go past each hurdle. And he shared that with the hiring manager. Received a pretty positive response of "thank you, appreciate this," but wasn't really mentioned beyond that. Fast forward, went through the remaining stages, landed the job offer a couple of weeks later. And when he was on the call with the hiring manager discussing the offer, the hiring manager was pretty honest that there was quite a lot of competition for the role at that stage, but the memo he produced was actually so good that they were using it internally as their framework for thinking about how to approach FedRAMP compliance at this company. And he'd never seen that kind of initiative taken from a candidate before. So I always highly recommend this approach to folks with one caveat, which is that this is obviously a very high effort and time intensive approach. Limit the roles that you do this for. It should be focused on roles that you feel the most excited for, and also ones where you feel a high level of conviction that you have good traction in the cycle already. So typically you want to wait until after the hiring manager conversation to take a step like this. You don't want to spin your wheels and work on a memo for a recruiter screen and then find out that there's some sort of hard requirement that you just don't meet and waste your time there. But if you feel like the hiring manager conversation went well and you have the capacity to do so, really doubling down on 1 or 2 interview processes in this way can help separate you.